Well, hello there. It is great to see you again, and welcome back to the latest installment of Path to Abundant Living. I am your host and moderator, Ryan Ruff, and as always, we've got the guys, Matt Norman, Scott Morrison, joining us from Morrison, Norman and Associates. And we're going to be unpacking another wealth management related topic. That's what we do here on the show. And today, we're going to be taking a little deeper dive into a topic that we did touch on a little while back, and that's just the general topic of asset protection. Well, today we're taking a little bit of a more nuanced approach into that, and let me frame this up, in a way that is just easy, flat out easy to understand. And that is, look, while divorce rates throughout the US have generally been falling for some time lately, the sad fact remains that there are a lot of marriages out there that just don't work out. So today we're going to be examining a few ideas and options really for protecting your financial assets, really safeguarding them from an ex-spouse in the event that maybe your marriage, to yours or that of a loved one ends in, a divorce. And obviously, and we've heard so many stories out there of divorces being messy. Last thing you want is that. But if you ever are faced with a divorce, you want to make sure that the plan is in place to safeguard those significant assets from an ex-spouse. So with that being said, let's go ahead and bring the guys on. Scott, Matt, it's good to see you guys this morning. How are we doing?
Good morning, Ryan. Great to see you. Hey, Scott. Good to see you too.
Hey, Matt.
Always good to be with you guys. And hey, we've got a touchy topic to dive into. It's not the most fun topic for us to get into today, but it's a worthwhile one. So, Scott, let me throw the first question over to you. Let's set the scene, start high level here like we tend to do on the show. The topic of divorce is obviously uncomfortable, but no one really wants to envision the end of their marriage, and whether it's for themselves or even maybe somebody that they care about. But it is an outcome that should be factored in when it comes to wealth planning. To talk to us a little bit about this and just why you feel that it really is a factor at the end of the day.
Well, I just had my 34th wedding anniversary over the weekend. And when my wife asked me what the topic was for this segment, I had a little trouble coming up with an answer because it just didn't seem like the right timing. And I think that's the big issue here is whenever you're thinking about getting married, how do you have that conversation about all the planning you're going to do while also planning for what happens if we break up? So it's obviously probably pretty short-sighted that you completely ignore the possibility of divorce when you're thinking about your wealth assets. But broaching this subject while deciding where the reception venue is going to be is kind of emotionally charged. So this is not something that's limited to just the couple that's getting married. It's also applicable to the parents and grandparents and even maybe some business partners.
Of course, of course. And so, Matt, what would you say then about that idea that exists out there of like, well, hey, we're planning for a wedding, but we've got divorce and separation already in mind? Would you say that it increases the probability of divorce in the first place? What are your thoughts on that whole concept and idea?
Really good question, Ryan. As Scott was alluding to, conversations around divorce and money can be emotionally charged. And, some people will foster that suspicion of and distrust going into the marriage of, well, if we talk about this, then it's going to make divorce more likely, but others believe, okay, this can help create clarity and ensure that everyone understands the rules regarding, who gets specific assets in the event that there is a divorce. So this can help, that process go more smoothly. It's probably more likely that addressing, these financial matters and resolving them going into the marriage may head off a nasty dogfight in the event of a divorce.
Sure. Yeah. Get out ahead of it at the end of the day. That's what we're saying here. But Scott, what would you then say? Let's get into the weeds here. What would you say are some of the asset protection strategies that, people should be looking into if maybe they are headed down the aisle sometime soon?
Well, a good place to begin is to understand some of the basics of how premarital assets are viewed in comparison to postmarital assets. Just like it sounds, premarital assets are those assets that you bring into the marriage that you had before the marriage versus postmarital assets that are created or enhanced after the wedding takes place. So in general, the property that you bring into a marriage, let's say an inheritance from a family member, would remain yours. And likewise, any inheritance you might receive during a marriage is generally treated as your own property. So still being separate from your spouse's. So that means in both cases, a court is likely to demand that the inheritance be divided between you and your ex-spouse upon divorce. Where in contrast, marital property is most of the personal property and the real estate that you acquire after you're married, including income that you earn from your job.
Roger that. So those are some of those preliminary asset protection strategies. Matt, do those distinctions or rules around those depend on the state that you live in? I would imagine they kind of vary. Could you shed some light on that?
Very much so, Ryan. For example, laws in some states will include a person's separate property with the couple's marital property and consider all of it eligible to be divided up in a divorce. So yes, the rule of thumb about marital versus non-marital assets, it's just that, a rule of thumb. And so in the event that you're even thinking about these issues, it's best to consult with an expert who has knowledge of what is and isn't allowed in your geographic area.
Roger that. And guys, I mean, we've seen divorce proceedings play out, sure, maybe in our personal lives, we have a relationship with it, so and so in your life got a divorce X amount of years ago. We also see it in entertainment, in shows, movies, and whatnot. We think we might have an understanding of how certain things work within divorce. But Scott, are there any important rules or really just concept around marital assets that people don't really fully understand, or maybe they just need to get up to speed on because maybe they think they know, but they don't really know? Anything like that?
Well, I don't know if people have to try to become experts on the subject themselves, but there are some ideas that are good to know about. For example, there's this thing called transmutation risk, kind of a fancy word, but in other words, it's those risks that non-marital assets will become marital assets in the eyes of the court because some certain circumstance occurs. Let's say that your spouse, and you each have separate bank accounts entering into the marriage, and those are considered non-marital assets. But at the time that you actually contribute money to each other's bank accounts after you're married, well, now you've got a commingling of those assets, and that may be divided now between ex-spouses in a court hearing. So there's always that related concept of active assets and passive assets as well. Active assets are going to increase in value because you and your spouse took some part or action in considering it to be active. So for example, if you bought a home and you were in a really good real estate market and you saw that home value went up, well, then that asset's going to be subject to court proceedings and a divorce, and something that you might have to make decisions about. Whereas in contrast, passive assets might be, let's say you inherited some stock, or you had something where the portfolio value increased from the time that you were married. Those can still be kept separate because it wasn't any action that you took. It was just the function of the market that the asset was residing in.
Got it. So, I mean, given all that, guys, I mean, are there essentially ways to maybe build a moat, a hypothetical moat around each of these separate assets that you might own, so that they stay separated, or better yet, remain in your wallet if divorce does come knocking?
The short answer, Ryan, is yes. An option that immediately comes to mind for most of us is the prenuptial agreement. This is a formally created document that specifies which property you want to remain yours in the event you get divorced. And speaking very generally, it can make sense to consider a prenuptial agreement in certain situations. And Scott touched on this a little bit. Is so, let's say you have children from a previous marriage, and the prenup will spell out your expectations for how your children from a past marriage will be provided for financially from your estate. And this can prevent an ex-spouse from claiming assets that you want your children to have in the future. And so another one is, we talked about this briefly, before we started today, is, what if one of you has significantly more wealth than the other? And so if there's this imbalance that exists, a prenup can formally detail which assets will remain separate in the event of divorce, or, maybe you expect to receive an inheritance down the road, and that prenup will help ensure that assets you receive from your family while you're married would remain yours post divorce. And one often kind of overlooked reason to consider prenup is, well, what if you're part of a family business? And that prenup will secure your interests in the family business that you bring into the marriage. Well, and those ownership interests, and then potentially, additional ownership interests that you gain during the marriage. One potential problem is, well, let's say you get divorced and you haven't factored this in. Well, now your ex-spouse can be part of that family business, which could be really uncomfortable for family members that are still working in there. And having that prenup can head off a lot of these potential issues.
Yeah, and this is the big one. I mean, this is the one that we hear so much about. Just see it existing in entertainment or existing in general society these days. Are those prenuptial agreements? But guys, if we're talking about bigger pieces of the pie or just more significant assets, even that are at the disposal of the individuals involved in these, are there any other tools or strategies that may go even beyond, your typical prenup, and what that can offer?
Yeah, the prenup isn't bulletproof necessarily. You've obviously heard of lots of instances where they've been contested and overturned. So some divorce experts, point people to trusts that can offer stronger asset protection in some cases. The one that comes to mind is the Domestic Asset Protection Trust. This kind of trust can shield assets from both creditors and ex-spouses. The shield is created by the irrevocability of this trust. So once you place assets in it, you can't just take them back or revamp the trust itself. This puts the assets out of the reach of most claims and excludes them from the category of marital property. However, unlike typical irrevocable trusts, you can name yourself as a discretionary beneficiary of a domestic asset protection trust, and thereby gives you some level of control. It's also really imperative that if you're going to go ahead and create a trust like this, that you need to have it in place and funded before the marriage actually takes place. And not all states, as we said before, not all states allow these kind of trusts, and the rules governing them vary from one state to the next. So there's a lot to navigate here.
Oh yeah, I mean that's a deep, multiple rounds of conversations, upkeep that's going on throughout. I mean, yes, that's a deep process. Appreciate you sharing that, Scott. But let's take the flip side now, Matt. Would you say, are there any other strategies that exist out there that maybe are way less complex and just maybe flat out easier for people to utilize? That just make general sense, can be easily implemented.
Short answer, yes. And we've mentioned a little bit of it, but separate assets can easily become commingled assets, and so they become grouped together with little more than a few online transfers between bank accounts. And if you want to avoid turning separate assets into marital assets, there's a couple simple steps. It's put your money in its own separate bucket. For example, don't merge inherited money into an account that includes your spouse's names or your spouse's funds. And so if you have accounts before you get married, then understand that you risk turning that into marital property if you deposit money into a spouse's account, or similar if you just put those funds together. Another step is maintaining titles of property in just one name. If you have a vacation home or other valuable asset that you acquired before getting married or remarried, keep the deed in your name. Don't add your spouse to it. If, again, this is a big if, you're concerned about protecting that property. That said, keeping homes separate can become tricky. If you spend some of your separate inheritance on a home that benefits both you and your spouse, the house may be viewed as by the court as marital property in a divorce. And so the best bet is to consult with a trusted attorney if you're unsure about how a financial move might impact the status of a particular piece of property. And so Ryan, let's face it, marriage and money are very sensitive issues on their own, and that's double when they're combined. This is an area that could potentially have a big impact on your family's wealth. So it's probably best not to ignore it. You know, when looking at this, you can be purposeful and intentional, or you could say, as a client was talking about, a problem I don't think about is a problem I don't have. And we all know if you don't think about it, the problem is still there.
Mhm. Amen. Amen. I mean, really well said there, Scott. Or I'm sorry, Matt. And guys, we have covered a lot of different specific issues. Actually, let me take that again. Amen. No, well said, Matt. And guys, we've covered a lot of really good strategies and things to consider and potentially implement if you are maybe walking down the aisle that day, or there are significant assets in play, or maybe there's that imbalance that Matt mentioned earlier. A lot of good stuff for our audience to consider. But let's say they're sitting there thinking, oh, maybe I do fall into this situation. Maybe I should take some steps to talk about, a prenuptial agreement, or just even just open up a dialogue and just start talking about it. And maybe they're interested in reaching out to you guys because these are conversations you're having with your clients on, when they pop up, and you're well versed in these areas clearly. What would be the best way that somebody out there, a member in our audience, could reach out to you and your team to just, like I said, open up that dialogue, start talking about whether or not there's a fit for this, and just how they would go about this process should they be walking down the aisle someday soon?
Well, we would invite you to, place that phone call to Morrison Nordman and Associates at 888-211-7307, or reach out through us through our website at morrisonnordman.com. We're involved in the social media world as well. So if you want to catch us on our Facebook page or in LinkedIn, Matt and I are both connected in all those different ways. So lots of ways to reach us.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Matt. Thanks, Scott. I appreciate you guys carving some time out of your day to jump into this topic. I know it's not a fun one to discuss, but hey, it is a necessary one. For people that might be approaching this time in their life. So, appreciate you being with us, and looking forward to the next one, guys.
Have a great day, Ryan.
Thanks, Ryan.
Alrighty, guys. And hey, look, we want to take one final moment, as always, and say thank you to the audience. We appreciate you guys jumping aboard here and being with us on the show today. If you took anything away from today's conversation, you benefited from it in any way, shape, or form, do us a favor, subscribe to the show on whichever platform you checked us out on today. That way you never miss a future, episode. And of course, share this information, right, with any friends, family, anybody that might be faced with this type of scenario moving forward. I've said it before on this show, and I'll say it again. We're taking the strategies, the solutions, the conversations that Matt and Scott are having with their clients routinely, and we're bringing them right here to you guys on this show. And by subscribing to our show, whichever platform that you is your favorite podcasting platform, you can be sure to never miss out on a great conversation full of value for you and yours. So for Matt and Scott, I'm Ryan. We're going to go ahead and say so long. But once again, we appreciate you being with us on today's installment of Path to Abundant Living.